Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the 2024 HIDA Prevention Summit. For those of you just joining us, I'm Laura Papard, Director of ADAPT, which is a National Training and Technical Assistance Division for Substance Use Prevention within the HIDAs. HIDA stands for High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area. There are 33 across the nation, and they have a HIDA prevention strategy that we are supporting. This morning, we have covered a variety of different topics. We've heard about positive childhood experiences from Dr. Christy Bethel. We've had a couple of different panels on school-based prevention guides and resources that are out there. And we've had an opportunity to apply some of the principles and pillars from those guides. I want to let you know that within your chat box, we will be posting a link to something called the Prevention Intervention Resource Center with ADAPT. It is on that link that you will be able to access the 3 new resources being issued today out of ADAPT in collaboration with so many external partners, so many external reviewers, prevention experts, even schools. We've had a variety of different input and feedback from both development and end users to create the products that you'll see today. We've already unfolded one. It was titled School-Based Prevention, Principles, Pillars, and Opportunities for School Community Collaboration. And we dove into a few of those concepts. We've applied it through various examples, but there's one very important piece within that guide called Synergies among Substance Use, Mental Health, and Violence Prevention. And we wanted to hold a very specific panel on this topic because there's a lot of bang for your buck when it comes to prevention strategies that might have shared risk and protective conditions and also shared outcomes with those individual emphases on both among substance use, mental health, and violence prevention. So we have asked Dr. Brian Bumbarger, thank you for joining us, Brian, to moderate a panel with some really neat folks. And right now I'll hand it over to one of our HIDA prevention coordinators to introduce these folks. And I did want to let you all know every single session today, the presenters are actually being introduced by our HIDA prevention coordinators that sit in one of our 33 HIDAs. So kind of a neat thing for this summit. And I'll turn it over to them.
Hi, my name is Paul McNeil, and I am the Prevention Coordinator for the New England High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area. The New England HIDA is committed to addressing substance use prevention by focusing on early intervention and community collaboration. We're currently conducting a comprehensive regional prevention needs assessment across 13 counties and 6 states to identify gaps and strengths in the prevention landscape. Through coalition focus groups and stakeholder interviews, we aim to develop a data-driven strategy that supports long-term public health and safety. By building strong partnerships and using evidence-based approaches, we're working to reduce substance use risks and strengthen prevention efforts across the region of New England. I'm excited to present to you our next group of panelists who will carry out our conversations about school-based prevention forward. Each panelist will share their unique perspectives on how they have engaged in school community partnerships to advance school-based prevention. They'll also draw out the natural synergies and opportunities among substance use, mental health, and violence prevention. Our moderator for this session is Dr. Brian Bumbarger, founding partner and CEO of Science, Systems, and Communities Consulting, a consulting firm dedicated to improving public systems and outcomes for communities, families, and children. He also serves as adjunct research faculty at both Colorado State University and Penn State University Prevention Research Centers, as well as the Reach Institute at Arizona State University. Dr. Bumbarger has nearly 3 decades of experience in prevention science and is a recognized leader in community capacity building, public systems improvement, and the adoption and scaling of effective practices. Our first panelist is Dr. Mark Greenberg. Dr. Greenberg is the Emeritus Bennett Chair of Prevention Science at Penn State University. He is one of the founders of CASTLE and is the author of over 350 journal articles and book chapters on the development of well-being, learning, and the effects of prevention efforts on children and families. He also serves as the chairperson of CREATE, a nonprofit devoted to improving schooling and the lives of teachers and students. Dr. Greenberg's work is a testament to his passion to nurture awareness and compassion in our society. Our next panelist is Ms. Caroline Davidson. Ms. Davidson is a director with the Practice Improvement and Consulting Team of the National Council for Mental Well-Being. In this role, she oversees several projects focused on harm reduction, substance use, and youth. Ms. Davidson has extensive experience in behavioral health with both academic and grassroots knowledge and experience in harm reduction, substance use disorder, and treatment. Our final panelist is Ms. Allison Maffey, Vice President of Social and Behavioral Health with the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials. Her work focuses on advancing equity through the prevention of injuries, suicide, firearm violence, adverse childhood experiences, and overdoses. Ms. Maffey's experience also includes 5 years with National Public Health Policy nonprofits, 3 years in local public health, and 10 years with the Injury and Violence Prevention Branch at the Colorado State Health Department, where she oversaw the statewide youth health survey and launched multiple substance misuse prevention programs. On behalf of the HIDA and the folks at ADAPT, join me in welcoming our panelists.
Well, thanks so much for that introduction, and welcome back from lunch, those who were on lunch break. It's been a fantastic summit so far. I've really enjoyed all of the presentations, and I think that the panel that we're about to kick off is just a great natural continuation of some of the themes that have been lifted up. Again, we're going to talk about this idea that substance use, violence, and mental health stem from shared risk and protective factors, and what that might imply for the way schools and community partners go about doing school-based prevention work. And so I'm excited to hear from our 3 panelists. And so without further ado, I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Mark Greenberg.
Thanks, Brian. Glad to be with you all today, and hope this is a meeting that's useful for you in the practical work of every day. I'm going to talk about this issue of preventing multiple risk factors, and I'm going to do it in the context of the idea of social and emotional learning. So here's a really big picture. I think that we all want healthy, caring communities in which children and adults are protected from things that would reduce our quality of life. And we really have these 4 undesired and related outcomes we see over and over again. It doesn't matter what kind of community we're in: poor school achievement, often poor mental health, often seen these days in depression and anxiety, aggression and violence, and substance use and abuse. And those are related outcomes, and they're related to some what I'd call underlying shared constraints, or you could think about them as risk factors. And those are acting impulsively, being emotionally dysregulated and not being very aware of your emotions, and having insecure relationships with others. Now, of course, we have larger risk and protective factors that are at the level of communities, the level of the quality of schools, et cetera, poverty. But it doesn't matter what community we're in. It doesn't matter if we're in a rural community, a suburban community, or an urban community. Children that are of impulsive action, don't regulate their emotions well, and have insecure relationships with both adults and with their peers are much more likely to show these poor outcomes. And so that's given us, for the last 25 or 30 years, a vehicle, if you will, to think about both the prevention of these problems. I won't call them disorders. Sometimes they become disorders, but also the promotion of well-being. And that is really social emotional learning. I'm sure some of you are very familiar with social emotional learning as a concept, and maybe some are not, but it's a process that all people, adults as well as young people, go through it to acquire and apply knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, to manage our emotions, which, as we know, is a lifelong problem for all of us, to achieve personal and collective goals together, to feel and show empathy for others, to establish supportive relationships, and to make responsible decisions. And kids who are in context, children who are in context in which they have and are developing these skills, well, the bottom line practically is they don't end up in the principal's office, and they don't end up in probation. at much lower rates. So let's talk a little bit more about social emotional learning. I'm one of the founders of CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, which you'll learn more about, www.casel.org. And when CASEL talks about social emotional learning, we talk about 4 different kinds of skills. The skills in the red are interpersonal skills, our ability to manage our behavior, our awareness of our emotions, of our capacities and our limitations. So it's really self-knowledge and self-awareness. Those in the blue are about our social relationships, our ability to be socially aware, to have empathy and compassion for others, to manage relationships, to manage the everyday of the conflict that we see in relationships without avoiding relationships or hurting others when when it's possible. And those are all wrapped around the idea of responsible decision making, that there are cognitive skills, of course, that we all are aware of, that we're teaching kids, to teach them how to respond in ways that are responsible and have a strong ethical background. Now, that's wrapped around the idea that we not only teach these skills, we teach them in curricula and in instruction in classrooms. And this is from pre-K, Head Start, all the way through college. And that is wrapped around school-wide practices and policies that reinforce the development of these skills, the modeling of these skills by adults throughout the school. And that's, of course, wrapped around the issue of family and community partnerships. So when we think about these skills, skills occur in context, and we have to make systems change to make these contexts work effectively so that when children learn these skills, practice and use them, they work effectively. Now, there's lots of research in the area of social emotional learning. This 2011 meta-analysis looked at 213 studies with over 2,700 students in K-12, and what you can see is that the science showed in these randomized and quasi-experimental trials, as you would expect, children who get good social emotional learning curricula improve in their social emotional skills, in their attitudes about themselves and others, their bonding and belonging to school, their positive classroom behavior, their ability to manage themselves and attend and learn. And that turned into an 11 percentile point gain in standardized achievement tests. So when we work on these underlying shared constraints of impulsive behavior, helping kids to stop and calm down to make good decisions, emotion dysregulation, helping them become aware of their emotions, how to talk about them and how to understand others, and use responsible decision making, it not only improves their behavior, but it gets them ready to learn so that teachers can teach and children can learn. And what we see over and over again is improvements in achievement test outcomes. So when you run into a principal or a school board member that says, we don't have time for this, there's never been a study that has shown that putting a quality, evidence-based social emotional learning program in school has ever reduced children's achievement. There's not one example in hundreds of studies. And that's because when children have these skills, they become bonded better to each other, to the teacher, and they're more ready to learn. And they're more motivated to learn because they feel that they belong. And of course, as a result, it reduces risk factors for conduct problems, for emotional distress, and for early substance use. And not only that, economists have looked at these programs and shown that on average, the average program for $1 invested has an $11 return over the life of children. It's pretty convincing data. There's one more recent analysis now showing this with over 1 million children and over 500 studies just published by Chris Cipriano at Yale. And this is not an American issue because there are randomized trials in 54 countries around the world that have studied the effects of social emotional learning. So this is a worldwide movement to change the education to make it more effective for children. And CASEL has a program guide. Many of you are familiar with the Blueprints guide. CASEL has a guide just for social emotional learning programs. And again, it looks at the evidence. And if programs have sufficient evidence at any grade level, they are in this guide. It's updated every year. And you can go to CASEL, go to the program guide, and you'll find programs around social emotional learning and development at each grade level that have shown high quality evidence. But SEL is more than just a curriculum or a program. Those programs are important because we know that the skills that children learn in these programs, as well as the attitudes they take on and the sense of belonging, are all important in improving their well-being, improving their academic abilities, and reducing their risk for substance abuse and mental health problems. So programs are a really critical component. But if we just thought that just slapping a program into a school is gonna change our communities, well, of course, we know that's not the case. Systems change occurs at the level of the classrooms, the schools, and it has lots of processes and components. And so CASEL has a systems-wide model of the indicators of social emotional learning from a school-wide systems change standpoint. And you could go through each one of these, I'll mention briefly, and do a rubric in your community or your elementary school or your middle or high school. How far is your school moving forward on each of these? So of course, the first one is what I've mentioned, explicit social emotional learning instruction using an evidence-based program. And that alone, as you know, to implement is not easy because it requires buy-in by the principal, by teachers. It requires quality training and ongoing supervision. But then we want to see that SEL is integrated, social emotional skills are integrated into academic instruction. We want to see that schools are places where youth voice and youth engagement, which has already been discussed today, are promoted, and children, and especially when they get to middle and high school, feel that their voice is important and it's shaping the nature of their own community, their own classrooms. We want to make sure, of course, that classroom, school, and climate is supportive. And when you have a good SEL program, of course, it improves those. We want to focus on adult SEL, and I'll come back to that because if teachers aren't well, nobody is well. We want supportive discipline that links to these social emotional learning programs. Rather than punitive discipline, we want restorative practices and supportive discipline models that help children to understand what went wrong, how they can resolve conflict, how they can make amends, and of course, sometimes receive consequences in addition. And we want a continuum of integrated supports. Social emotional learning is universal for all children. All children need these abilities to survive in life, and we know that ourselves. But we want to integrate this with Tier 2 and Tier 3 with MTSS models so that the same language is used across the whole school. And then in the yellow, you see we think about authentic family partnerships. How do we really join with families together so that they feel part of this and have input to it? We want to align it with community partnerships, after school programs and agencies. We need systems for measuring continued improvement. But if we don't have well teachers, we don't have well students. And we've studied the development of teachers across the school year, looking at their physiological wear and tear. And this is exactly what we see. We see the teachers across the year just burn out. Thank God we have summertime for teachers, for them to recover. And we've shown this in terms of their physiological wear and tear, and it takes an entire summer for them to recover. So teacher well-being is a really important part of this, and we have shown in a series of randomized trials that when we improve teacher well-being by helping them to have skills to manage their own emotions and to develop better relationships with students, we see stronger relationships with students, we see fewer discipline problems, greater engagement, and higher academic performance. And yet, while schools often will adopt social emotional learning programs for children, we've seen very few schools make the investment in the well-being of their teachers. But when teachers feel well and work together as a community, that's when we see real systems change. What lessons have we learned? Of course, as you probably have already heard many times, but I'll say it one more time, across many evidence-based programs, fidelity really matters. The best outcomes come from high quality fidelity, which also means adaptation to the context that we're in, every context being different. And high fidelity results from careful attention to the implementation of not just programs, but of practices and policies that support those programs. So what are the implications of all this? We know that social emotional learning works. There are now over 500 studies showing the outcomes of SEL. It reduces problems in mental health, substance abuse, and violence, because these things are all interconnected. And when we deal with these underlying shared constraints of impulsive behavior, of emotion dysregulation, and the quality of relationships, as you would guess, it improves them all. Positive outcomes also include academic achievement. And when you're speaking to schools, this is why schools exist. It's critical to be discussing this. And outcomes are very similar across contexts, urban, rural, minoritized and non-minoritized populations, and across grades. It has a good economic return on investment, which is important from a school board standpoint. It's doable. We know that well-trained teachers show strong outcomes, and we know that teachers want SEL. There's been lots of national surveys showing that's the case. And lastly, we need support. We need effective planning to lead to effective implementation. You can't just walk in the building and start to do this without getting readiness and buy-in. We need integration between universal SEL programs and the other tiers of support, especially as it relates to kids as they get older and are having more complex problems. And SEL requires greater support from federal and state policies. So I hope I've given you a little quick tour of the underlying constraints, how we can improve those through high quality social emotional learning, but that we really need to think about it as a system that has evidence-based programs, policies, and practices. Thank you.
Mark, thank you so much for that presentation. I'm so excited to follow him and share a little bit more about additional data collection, how public health can work so closely with the school system in this prevention intersection. And as a parent of a child who benefited significantly from social emotional learning, we know how important it is. So as we talk a little bit about the public health and the education intersection, just a little bit about who ASTHO is, the Association of State and Territorial Health Officials. We work with those state public health agencies to develop strong leaders, improve public health through capacity building and thought leadership, and advocate for the resources and policies that improve the public's health and well-being. And a major part of that is often through the collection of data. So how can public health work with schools to prevent adolescent substance use? A major part of that is looking at the resources we have available to us for surveillance to look upstream. You've heard this talked about a needs assessment, the data on risk and protection, the data on social determinants of health. Roger Dinwiddie in the session prior did an incredible job outlining the role that community partners play, that we can't pretend that we know what schools need most, that they know and see what their students are going through, and data helps inform that for them. And their number one role really is to primarily focus on academics, so of course they know they can't do that without looking at the whole child. So how can we come in partnership together? Well, you've heard us talk about shared risk and protective factors, SRPFs. So a risk factor are the characteristics and conditions that increase the likelihood of experiencing an adverse health or quality of life outcome. And the protective factors are the inverse, the characteristics and conditions that decrease or mitigate the likelihood of an adverse outcome and increase the likelihood of experiencing positive outcomes. And when we say shared, we mean that when you focus on just one of those factors, you have the ability to impact multiple adverse health outcomes. I'm going to spend some time talking about Colorado. In the introduction, you heard that I spent about 18 years working in public health here in our state. And I know that work best, though now I work at the national level, and Colorado is not the only state doing this work. You heard some great examples from Tennessee and their youth health survey. But the important thing when we think about the practical application, okay, so how can public health support this work? And then how can we build the bigger tent to come together to actually implement the strategies? Really coming together as a community to say, what data do we already have available that talks about risk or protective factors? And risk and protective factors, there are so many different theoretical models and research out there about how you collect the data, what are the right indicators, what questions you could ask, who you ask them to, where you collect the data. There are so many options. And so you need a group of people with that focus in mind that come together and say, okay, we already have this information about availability of substances in our community, or access to firearms, or economic instability. What information do we not have? What does the research show us could be another risk factor or protective factor? How could we go about collecting that data? And these definitions that were created specific for Colorado were based on the available and consistently measured factors and outcomes that Colorado had access to. So in the resources that are shared afterwards, there's links to this information so that you can access it directly and see how it might apply to your jurisdictions. The other interesting thing about this approach that Colorado did is collecting that investment across multiple state agencies, local agencies, partners, that have an interest, a vested interest in either directing efforts towards one of these risk or protective factors, who's invested in limited academic success in a community and might want to collect better data about that to inform the prevention work that happens in communities, and who's interested in violence outcomes and might want to invest in a data collection system that can collect better data about that can inform violence prevention outcomes. And so it's a shared effort coming together that can help make sure the data gets back into the hands of local communities, that they know and can see what is going on in their area and be able to make decisions about it. Another important aspect of this work was really elevating youth voice that came up in the last session as well, that youth have a say in what questions are asked about them. You know, nothing about us without us. That the data collection efforts can really be informed by adolescents themselves to say what are the outcomes most important to them and what are the risk and protective factors of importance to them that we also see in the research. Like there's an intersection of all of this. Additionally, an important part of this is as the data goes back into the hands of local communities is keeping them in choice. That's some of the trauma-informed work that I've been a part of, and I love that phrase, keeping people in choice always. And so how do we keep parents in choice about student participation? How do we keep youth in choice about what questions are part of the survey? How do we keep schools in choice about how the data is shared and used? So really being able to drive that relationship between public health and their surveillance expertise and schools. And then additionally, to the next slide here, as we look across what a protective factor may be, we think about all of the different outcomes and partners that might be invested in seeing a reduction in violence by addressing this protective factor, seeing a reduction in substance abuse by addressing this protective factor. When they come together, it becomes less about what you should be doing schools or you should be doing criminal justice system. Instead, what can we all do to address these risk and protective factors together? Here's another one, limited commitment to the value of school. That has documented outcomes across all of the outcomes of interest here: substance misuse, depression, anxiety, teen pregnancy, school dropout, violence, and delinquency. And so what does it mean for public health and all of the community partners to come around to school to say, how do we help you impart the value of what school and academic success can bring to students? How do we reinforce that? How do we become a community that says school is vital to the future you want for yourself, and we all reinforce that together? I also wanted to share there's new research, and this is linked in the resources that are coming out afterwards, that just came out, published in the Journal of Public Health Management and Practice, about how public health can help schools with that data interpretation, being able to look at scales, being able to identify where they fall. You can see here difference between local and state. This risk factor is lower than the state level, which is a great sign. You have less of this risk factor in your community. This one's a little bit higher. This could be an area of importance. And so then with this information that a public health partnership and school partnership can come together to do, to then apply that art and science of looking at data, because it's never just the science, it's never just where the data, what the data says, but to be able to say what is most important to our community then from this data to be able to prioritize. So from there, talking a little bit more about how we use the data to inform academic and prevention strategies, which was that, I believe it was a third pillar. I love how Anthony Jackson in the last session talked about how some work looks like substance abuse prevention and some work does not. And very often the role that we can play is supporting the work that doesn't always say substance use top and center. That a lot of the work that we're going to do that is prevention work isn't going to lead with substance education, isn't going to lead. A lot of it is that social emotional learning. A lot of it is parent engagement. A lot of it is lifting youth voice to be able to feel like they have a say in their decisions in their families and their schools. And this is where the opportunity to braid and layer funds and build that larger tent come together. So coming back to this protective factor of community opportunities for pro-social involvement and connection. Some of you may have heard about the Iceland prevention model, where they invested significantly in recreational centers, after school opportunities, essentially just pro-social locations, rec centers, places where youth could be so that they had an opportunity to invest in something positive that they were looking forward to. And they saw the rates of suicide and substance use drop significantly within Iceland. And so really that's that shared risk and protective factor approach that we can all come together. When we think about braiding and layering, then those who have funding to address substance misuse, what does it mean that they can invest in? There's an original after-school program started in Colorado called Tony Gramsci's Youth Services. It was all about investing pro-social youth engagement. It was originally funded for specific violence prevention efforts. Those were the stated outcomes. And yet, as cannabis was legalized within the state, many of the cannabis tax dollars were dedicated to enhancing that program and making it even larger, to be able to invest even more in those pro-social opportunities for youth, because it's shared outcomes across both. So a shared risk and protective factor approach can mean a lot of things as we come together and around schools, that we have an agreed upon strategy. So one very specific thing, we're all going to invest in getting a rec center built in our community because that's something that we need. Or it might be that we have an agreed upon specific objective, that objective of changing pro-social youth involvement opportunities in our community, but we're all going to do it different ways. Maybe you're going to start some sports things, you're going to work on a rec center, someone's going to focus on after school programs, someone's going to focus on the library and the type of programming that it offers, or an agreed upon theme or category. We're all improving pro-social opportunities for youth. We're going to talk to parents about the importance of making pro-social decisions as a family, like what it means to have family, to center youth voice and family decision making and provide them with more family-friendly events that they can go to in a community. The school is going to increase pro-social programming through offering youth leadership opportunities. Local churches are doing that as well. It can really look like everyone's taking their own strategy, but we're coming together on a shared theme. And this same approach could be applied to any of those risk and protective factors that we looked at above. Limited academic success, that youth are really struggling. We see that one also impacts all of the outcomes. What can parents be doing? What can community be doing? What can school be doing to all invest in that together? Or maybe it's just one strategy and we all help make sure our school gets more funding for X in order to do a better job in that area. The other thing that I really wanted to talk about is that very often when substance use is our issue, an area of importance, that we sometimes forget about the causal factors or related issues that are leading to that outcome. And so for those of us, my entire career has really focused on substance use prevention, but through this shared risk and protective factor approach, what we know is just educating youth directly about the potential harms of substance use doesn't address the reasons why they use. And so what we learned from the research is that teens report seeking relief from stress, anxiety, and depression as their top reasons for substance use. So really, we do have to get at those underlying issues, and just educating about the risks of high concentration THC or the risks of alcohol use isn't going to be enough to address the factors of why they got there. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when we look at campaigns. Campaigns are often a first thought that we go to when communities come around schools and want to address something. We want to launch a campaign, but very often that's where we need to exercise a little bit of caution, because the best practices in social marketing campaign incorporate that it really should be about improving their welfare, promoting voluntary behavior changes, not just improved awareness, and also using positive messaging that promotes a pro-cause mentality. More information doesn't necessarily mean we make healthier choices. And so something to keep in mind with campaigns is that it's not always about the information, it's about aspiring to the attitude of who I want to be. So that positive messaging and the pro-cause mentality is vital in any of our campaign efforts. I want to be the kind of parent who is available for tough conversations with my kids. Yes, that might mean I need a little more information about THC and alcohol and all of these other things, but the campaign is really about that pro-cause mentality of what is the kind of parent I want to be, what is the type of community we want to be. And best practices really do include message testing with the intended audience. So just a few examples of some campaigns that we've seen recently that really are that pro-cause mentality of, like, parents, you are capable of having these conversations with youth about THC, and here's the information you need. But the leading message in the campaign efforts is really about, you can have that conversation. And then when you get further into the campaign, that's where you get the information that you need about THC. And now here's another example within Colorado. This one actually is not outcome specific at all. That doesn't necessarily talk about vaping or fentanyl, or it doesn't talk about cannabis. It's really just about a game-changing guide for strengthening relationships with your teen. You can talk to your teen about what they're struggling with every day. Whether it's sexual identity, whether it's racism, whether it's violence that they've experienced, you can talk to them. And here are the tools that you need to have better conversations. And then through that, as you get deeper and deeper and deeper, yes, we want schools to be partners in giving more information about specific substances, but that it's really about the changing that pro-social mentality of the kind of conversations you can have. And SAMHSA's campaign, Talk, They Hear You, is really similar in this way. So just wrapping up, there's a lot of resources that I shared. Many of these are connected if you want to learn more about risk and protective factors and some of that research and data collection, or resources about effective social marketing campaigns. Those are all linked. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carolyn.
Thank you so much, Ali. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Brian. I'm very excited to be here and to talk a little bit about one of the National Council's projects and how we can use the intersecting learnings from that project for youth mental health and violence prevention. So this goes more into that one-to-one level of what Ali was discussing. So quickly, just wanted to give you a brief overview. In between 2020 to 2023, the National Council was funded by the CDC to lead an initiative to assess the effects of the pandemic on substance use risks and drivers among youth ages 12 to 18. And really, this initiative also aims to give youth serving providers, organizations, and adults the tools and resources they need to support effective prevention messaging. And as you'll see from this slide, over the course of the project, we conducted a literature review, an environmental scan, focus groups, we engaged youth ambassadors, we surveyed more than 2,900 youth and more than 700 youth serving providers. And from those surveys, found out some really interesting pieces around not just what drives youth substance use, as Ali discussed, but what prevents youth from using substances, and similarly, how that's related to youth mental health and then violence prevention. And so something exciting that I want to talk about starting off is that I know we hear a lot about the challenges that youth are facing and what their risks are. And the great thing is that we also know that there are strengths among youth. And so this part is just focusing from that survey I mentioned with more than 2,900 youth. This is looking at, in particular, resiliency and optimism. So you'll see here that 77% of youth agree that they're a good person who has a lot to offer. 76% agree that they can stand up for themselves and what they believe in. 71% agree that they are hopeful about the future. And 69% of youth agree that they can calm themselves down. So similar to what you've heard earlier and throughout this presentation, we can really capitalize on and support those existing areas of strength that youth have. And I'll get to how to do that in just a moment. But wanted to also talk briefly about the reasons that youth reported that they would not use substances. So we know that there are a lot of reasons that youth may choose to use substances, but we also see here that almost a third of youth reported that there are these different reasons, so that it may be bad for their health, that they're just not interested, that it might mess up their plans for the future, and that they want to make healthy choices. And I'll note that something interesting about these data are that, for instance, we found that there are definitely some differences at the subpopulation level, if you will. So for instance, talking about goals instead of plans work better for boys and for older youth and youth in urban areas. And for instance, we found that options related to coping, girls are more likely to choose that as a reason to use substances than boys. And really an overall takeaway here is that we found that youth really care about their health, especially their mental health. So now on to a quick poll, because I would love to hear your thoughts. And Laura, I will look to you to do the tech side of things. Wanted to know, does these data, if you use data in the plural, resonate with what you're seeing in the communities you serve And is there anything that surprised you about those data? And I'll give Laura a moment to kick off that poll.
Okay, it's been kicked off. You should be seeing it on your screen now. We'll give you a few more seconds. All right. Carolyn, for the question of did it resonate, does the data resonate with what you are seeing in youth? It's an overwhelming yes, about 71%, but 24% are unsure. I'm sharing that result with all of you in the audience. Okay, and I am unable to see the other responses at this time, Carolyn.
That is totally fine, Laura. I know that Zoom can be a bit finicky. I'm glad to hear that these data do resonate in a lot of ways. And that's great that we know that our youth have inherent strengths. And also, I'm excited to look at those results later in terms of what surprised you. Moving into the sort of pragmatic, the so what? What do you do? You're obviously here. You clearly care about youth and are somehow involved in youth, whether that's working directly with youth themselves or whether that's working with people who work with youth. So what is your role as school staff or beyond? Really, the important piece is creating a safe space to normalize conversations around substance use, mental health, and their connections to mental health, school, finances, relationships, violence prevention. Uh, Ultimately, we have a collective obligation to support youth in our own ways and those who work with youth. So what that means, if you don't directly work with youth, is giving your staff the tools that they need to have those conversations. And I'll show you those tools in just a moment. And we also know, touching on those shared risk and protective factors, to maximize regular touch points and establish relationships to reinforce those prevention messages and create those healthy relationships. And then, of course, those potential risk and protective factors. And I'll emphasize that even if you're not engaging in substance use prevention conversations yourself, just being a consistent and safe person is really important. We know from the research that youth feel most comfortable talking to those consistent, safe people, even if they find that providers are usually the most accurate source of information. So now into the how do you do this? So getting candid, we developed in particular a communication pathway that starts with establishing trust, gathering insights, then framing the conversation, making the case, and suggesting action. And so building off of Mark and Ali's conversations, this communication pathway is really designed to help you or your staff have those one-to-one conversations in a way that uplifts the skills that you already have, uplifts their areas of resilience, and helps them kind of lean into those reasons that they don't want to use substances, that they want to seek support, that they don't want to engage in violence. And so some tips, what we found important for this project was engaging with youth directly to understand what they found most valuable. So from our group of youth ambassadors, we had around 15 youth ambassadors of various different ages. And some of the key tips that they gave were to not assume that you understand the experiences or identities of people from different cultures or religions, to validate those experiences, but not necessarily assume that you know exactly what that's like. To ask youth to explain that perspective that they're bringing, ask youth how they want to be recognized and really respected when they're receiving services and care, and ask about any like doubts or concerns that they may have. And in addition, some kind of other tips we heard were asking permission before giving advice or information. I know often we have an instinct that we want to give youth the solutions, but often, you know, they might not be ready to receive that. Just like I am not always open to hearing suggestions from the people I work with and the people I love. Also, a key thing that we heard from youth is the importance of adults being authentic, real and honest, not being misleading, not trying to be somehow cool, but just being honest and saying, these are, this is what I see as the benefits and risks. You told me that you really want to lean into your sports activities, into, say, your softball team. You've also said that substances could be a risk for you being able to do that. Tell me more about that. And then the gather insights piece. So really asking youth, what matters to you in your life and why? When you're faced with a tough choice, how do you make a decision? The importance here is really around open-ended questions so that you can become an opportunity to connect what matters to them with substance use prevention, with violence prevention, with their mental health. You'll notice that these questions are not necessarily specific to substance use, but rather building a connection with youth so that you're able to support them. And then moving along to the next slide, and when you're framing the communication, and these ones are specifically for substance use, but you'll see that several of these can also be for other areas of focus. So this doesn't just have to apply to substance use. And you'll notice that we've divided this up in some places by different messaging that resonated with different groups. So for instance, with relationships, we found that middle school youth care a lot about not disappointing the people in their lives. Whereas for high school youth, they resonated more with the idea of making them proud. And you'll see under activities and self-affirmation, it's about affirming the reasons that youth choose not to engage with substance use, choose not to engage in violence. Moving on to the next step, and then we just have one more poll and we get to go into Q&A. And these are some tangible actions that you can suggest to youth as ways of coping with stress that might otherwise be a reason that they turn to substance use, might otherwise be a reason that they have mental health impacts, that they turn to violence. Is some ways of doing that, exploring new ways of dealing with stress, educating themselves about drugs and alcohol, for instance, or about mental health needs, making their own personal commitment or pledge, finding someone that they can talk to, and talking to their friends. And you'll note that you'll see these asterisks here. Those are some that resonated particularly well with middle school youth. And so I'll note, kind of before I go on to that final poll, really the focus of Getting Candid in particular, but also this work more broadly, is that we know that you can and are in many cases are a trusted place for youth to turn. We know that youth value having that trusted place, and there are practical ways that you can become that trusted space for youth, and that you can build on the skills and values that they already have. And with that, I will go to the final poll. So would love to know, have you tried to initiate conversations with youth around substance use, mental health, or violence? And that doesn't just need to be students. That can be youth that you interact with in any capacity, whether that's on a team, at your church, your kids. And then how have these conversations gone? And Laura, I'll turn it to you for the tech side.
All right, and we'll see if the open-ended piece of this poll will work. We've got about almost half that have participated so far. All right. So in response to the first question, around 93 to 94% have tried to initiate conversations with youth. Yeah. I'll go ahead and end that poll. And for whatever reason, I'm sorry, Carolyn, the open-ended pieces are not showing for me. Yeah, I'm hearing from the audience that they also might not be receiving that second part. So Zoom team, I don't know if you could assist with that, but
that is
I'll
very
go ahead and
okay.
close out.
Thank you. I'm imagining your responses. If you run into me in person, certainly tell me out loud. Would love that. And I'm grateful for those who were able to engage in the poll regardless. I think what I'm hearing from the audience and the fact that you have tried initiating those conversations is already, we talked about youth strengths is already emphasizing your strengths and willingness as people who engage with youth regularly. And I'm hopeful that this summit and the tools, both from this panel and more broadly, can help you do so more effectively and also give you the confidence that you're already trying to do it. Let's help you build those skills. And so with that, my last slide is just about the resources from Getting Candid, which you'll notice there's a bit around substance use, but also really broadly around how do you have motivational conversations with youth? How do you create those safe spaces? What are some risk and protective factors? And I'll note that we both have resources for sort of youth-facing adults, and we also have resources written by and for youth. And with that, I'll turn it back to Brian.
Thanks so much, Carolyn, and thank you, Mark and Ali. Wow, what a fantastic panel! It just flows so nicely from all of the content shared this morning. I imagine that a lot of our nearly 2,000 audience members might feel like they've been drinking from a fire hose all morning. So I'm so glad that ADAPT and Laura and Patty are recording all these things, and they'll be posted and shared, and people can go back and review things that they heard and take some notes. So I hope you're just drinking it all in. Before we open it up to Q&A, I'm really excited about how, all the questions that we must have gotten from audience members, but I just want to take just maybe 2 minutes and just reinforce something and unpack a little bit this idea of shared risk and protective factors, because I have to say this is a foundational understanding that is necessary to do really good prevention work. And so I'm going to give you 2 vocabulary terms to add to your prevention toolbox that you can show off at dinner parties or in when you're playing. I don't know if people play Trivial Pursuit anymore, but the ideas of equifinality and multifinality. And so this is 2 different ways to look at the idea that these shared risk and protective factors are shared across many diverse outcomes. And so the idea that we've heard about, that one of the ideas that we've heard about is this idea of equifinality, that any outcome that, and this is probably something that you are familiar with, but we need to think about both of these things, that any outcome, whether it's substance use, mental health, violence, any outcome, it can be traced back to multiple risk factors. And those risk factors exist in multiple domains of a child's life. And that's important to keep in mind, because we can't just be working on one risk factor within one domain, because there are things that might be occurring in other domains of that child's life, that student's life, that might be counteracting the good work that we're doing on one risk factor within one domain. And then the idea of multifinality, that if you address any one risk factor, you're almost certainly going to potentially impact many poor outcomes. And we've talked about that quite a bit, but we also want to think about this from an equifinality standpoint as well. And Ali showed this idea, but this concept that if you put risk and protective factors and behavioral outcomes on a matrix, and you can draw these horizontal lines and vertical lines, it really does help to think about, well, what does this mean for doing good prevention work in a school-based setting, for example, or in any other setting? It really does help you think about, well, are we being comprehensive in our approach? At one point in my career, I managed Pennsylvania's Center for Safe Schools, and in that role, I had to visit all 500 school districts across Pennsylvania. And the one thing I saw over and over and over again, and going in and talking to the different folks that were working in schools, was that you could go into almost any school and you could find the teen pregnancy prevention coordinator and the violence prevention coordinator and the drug prevention coordinator. And there were all these siloed programs and siloed jobs. And that doesn't reflect this understanding of a shared underlying risk and protective factors for all of these problems. So with that, I'll turn it back to Laura to share with us some of the questions that we got from the audience.
Thank you, Dr. Bumbarger. And just so you all know, panelists, a lot of appreciation for what has been shared today. And especially, you know, the geek in me is really loving those tables of the shared risk and protective conditions. Thank you, Ali, for those. Thank you, Dr. Bumbarger. Really just puts things in perspective in an organized way. I'm actually going to end here. We have time for one question. And I'm going to ask the question of Carolyn and then anyone else who might want to contribute, but it's a really important one. When you open the conversation with youth, but all you get back is, I'm fine. I'm fine. What is the best counter for that type of response? And why do behaviors like vaping in bathrooms, which is a huge one we get in all the time for TA, why does that seem to still be happening, even if a conversation might be well received by the youth? So I know it's a double header.
No, I love that. And actually the answers really are interrelated. So thank you for asking that question. I'd say that as you all know, that building trust, whether that's at the individual level or the community level, takes a lot of time. And so I found in my conversations with youth and with adults who use drugs, who don't use drugs, that a lot of that fine may come from a place of not yet feeling like they can be open with you. And that's all right. They don't have to talk the first time that you ask them a question. What I find is important when a youth isn't ready to engage is giving them that space. So saying, you know, how would you like to use our time together? Do you want to sit and talk? Do you want to just share your day with me? You know, if you can, could you walk me through what you did today? Just taking the pressure off of them to have to still their feelings on the first time and rather building that trust. And then I'll note to the second question, okay, why does vaping continue? We know that there are all of these programs. And there's obviously a confluence, or not obviously, there's a confluence of factors that we know at a community level, the reasons that Ali touched on that youth do choose to use substances, and that it takes time. You know, I think what we also know is that people use substances for a number of different reasons. There's not really ever been a time, you know, even going as far back as when there were substances like plant-based substances, before there were synthetic substances, people have always used substances. And so I think the point is, we know that substances will exist. We know that the option is there. How do we give youth options that, you know, they might use once or twice, but they realize this isn't for me, or they realize, you know, I'm just gonna like only do this on the weekends or only do this once in a blue moon. How do we slowly, I hate to say chip away, it's not a wall. How do we slowly give youth the tools that they need to make different choices, and particularly frame it as that, as them making different choices and not them making a right or wrong choice.
Thank you. Great way to end. And I just want to acknowledge, we have had several questions come in. Mark, we've provided the Castle website, a lot related to Castle, and many just coming in from personal experience and you all wondering and asking the hard questions, right? And many of them we cannot get to right now, but we have tried to provide every resource possible for you within the resource supplement, and have been chatting access to various resources that have been discussed throughout this panel today in your chat box. So I hope that that can be helpful. Ali, Carolyn, Mark, Brian, thank you. Wonderful panel discussion and was extremely well received by all. We appreciate you. Thanks so
for the
much.
opportunity, Laura.
At this time, we're going to close out of this session and we'll be transitioning into our next panel, where we will be releasing our second tool of the summit. That panel is titled Key Considerations for Integrating Fentanyl Education and Naloxone Training into Schools. We'll see you over there.